He thought humiliating her would be effortless. But the moment Professor Richard Harrington called Sarah Mitchell to the front of the lecture hall, he had no idea he was stepping into the one mistake that would unravel everything. The room was packed. Over 100 students filling the tiered seats, laptops open, whispers bouncing off the polished wood walls as the late afternoon sun stretched through tall windows, casting long shadows across the stage where Sarah stood in her plain gray uniform, a cleaning cart left forgotten by the door, her presence out of place in a room built for brilliance. And yet it was her quiet voice just minutes earlier that had triggered this entire moment. She had pointed out something small, almost invisible, a subtle inconsistency in Harrington's equation, something most wouldn't dare question, especially not someone like her. And that was all it took. Harrington smiled. But it wasn't warmth, it was pride sharpened into something colder. Something performative, the kind of smile that needed an audience, and today, he had one. "If you believe there's an error," he said, gesturing toward the massive chalkboard stretching nearly 12 feet wide, "why don't you come up here and solve it for us?" A few students chuckled, others exchanged glances, already sensing what this was, not an invitation, but a setup. Sarah hesitated for half a second, her fingers tightening slightly around the cloth she had been holding, her eyes scanning the room, not with fear, but with a kind of quiet calculation, as if measuring something no one else could see. "Go on," Harrington added, stepping aside with a theatrical sweep of his arm. "We'd all love to learn from you." And that did it. The laughter grew a little louder now. Phones subtly lifted, anticipation building, not for brilliance, but for embarrassment. Sarah walked forward slowly, her footsteps soft against the polished floor, each step echoing louder than it should, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting. Up close, the chalkboard towered over her, filled with layers of complex calculus, symbols and integrals woven into a problem that even advanced students struggled to follow. The kind of equation Harrington had built his reputation on. He crossed his arms, confident, already imagining the outcome, already seeing her falter, apologize, step away. But Sarah didn't speak. She didn't rush. She simply reached for the chalk, her hand steady, her expression unreadable, and for a moment, nothing happened, the silence stretching just long enough to make the audience lean in, to let the tension settle into their chests. Then, without warning, she began to write, not hesitantly, not guessing, but with precision, each line flowing into the next as if the solution had always been there, waiting, her movements calm, efficient, almost practiced, the soft scrape of chalk against the board becoming the only sound in the room. A few students frowned, trying to follow. Others stopped whispering entirely, something shifting in the air, subtle but undeniable, and Harrington's smile, once sharp and certain, began to fade just slightly as he leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, because what he was seeing didn't match the outcome he had planned, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face as Sarah paused mid-equation, tilted her head just a fraction, and continued writing as if she were correcting not just the problem, but him. The chalk kept moving, steady and precise, and with every line Sarah added, the atmosphere in the lecture hall began to shift in a way no one could ignore. What started as quiet amusement slowly dissolved into focused silence as students leaned forward, eyes narrowing at the board, trying to follow the logic unfolding in real time. Because this was no random attempt, no lucky guess. It was structured, deliberate, almost elegant, and that was the first thing that unsettled Professor Harrington. The elegance. He had spent years crafting his reputation on complexity, on making the difficult feel unreachable, and yet here she was, unraveling it with a clarity that felt almost effortless. A student in the second row stopped typing, her fingers hovering above the keyboard, while another slowly lowered his phone, no longer interested in recording a failure that was not coming. Sarah's handwriting was clean and measured, each symbol placed with intention, as if she had walked this path many times before, and perhaps she had, though no one in that room had ever thought to ask. Harrington shifted his weight slightly, the confidence in his posture tightening into something more rigid, his arms no longer comfortably crossed but held closer, as if bracing against something unseen. "Interesting approach," he said, attempting to regain control, his voice cutting through the quiet. but it lacked the ease it carried before, and Sarah did not respond. She did not even look back. She simply continued, her focus locked on the board, her world narrowed down to numbers, symbols, and truth. The equation stretched across nearly 6 feet of chalkboard now, evolving into something none of the students recognized from the original problem. And that was when the murmurs returned, softer this time, not mocking but uncertain, because they could sense it too, that what they were witnessing was no longer part of Harrington's design. One student whispered, "That is not how he taught it." And another replied, "No, but it makes more sense." And those words, quiet as they were, landed harder than any laughter ever could. Harrington heard them, and for the first time, his gaze sharpened not with superiority, but with scrutiny, following her steps more closely now, searching for an error, a miscalculation, anything that would restore the balance of power he had so carefully constructed. But there was nothing obvious, no hesitation, no correction, only forward movement. Sarah paused briefly, her eyes scanning what she had written, and in that stillness, the entire room seemed to hold its breath again, waiting for the crack, the mistake, the moment everything would fall apart. But it did not come. Instead, she lifted the chalk again and drew a clean line beneath the previous work, separating it, almost as if she were closing a chapter. And then she began again, this time with fewer steps, more direct, cutting through the complexity with a simplicity that felt almost impossible. A professor in the back row, visiting from another department, straightened in his seat, his expression shifting from casual observation to genuine interest, because he recognized what was happening before most others did, that this was not just correct, it was better. Harrington took a step closer to the board now, unable to stay back any longer, his eyes moving rapidly, tracing each symbol, each transformation, and with every passing second, the realization grew heavier, settling into the space between certainty and doubt. Sarah reached the final line, her hand slowing just slightly as she wrote the concluding expression, the answer emerging not as a dramatic reveal, but as a quiet certainty, something that had always been there, waiting to be seen the right way. She stepped back half a step, not turning to face the room yet, not seeking approval, not acknowledging the dozens of eyes fixed on her. And in that suspended moment, the silence was no longer empty. It was full, thick with the weight of everything that had just shifted, everything that was about to be understood, and everything Professor Harrington was no longer sure he could control. For a long second, no one moved, no one spoke, and then Professor Harrington stepped closer, his shoes echoing softly against the polished floor. His eyes locked onto the final line Sarah had written, as if searching for something that would restore his certainty. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words did not come immediately, because what sat on that board was not just a correct solution. It was a different way of seeing the entire problem, a cleaner path, one that bypassed the unnecessary complexity he had built into his original method. A faint murmur began to ripple through the room again, but this time it carried a different tone, not doubt, not ridicule, but recognition, the kind that spreads when people realize they are witnessing something rare. A student near the front leaned toward his classmate and whispered, "She simplified it." And the reply came almost instantly, "No, she redefined it." And those words hung quietly in the air, unnoticed by most, but not by Harrington. His fingers twitched slightly at his side, a subtle break in his composed exterior, as he traced her steps again, faster now, trying to find the flaw he expected to be there, the oversight that would allow him to regain control of the room. But every transformation held, every transition was sound, and the final expression stood firm, undeniable. Sarah finally turned, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same calm presence she had carried from the beginning, her eyes steady, meeting his without challenge, without apology, simply present. "You skipped a constraint," she said softly, her voice clear enough to carry across the silent hall. "That is why the original approach becomes unstable after the third iteration." And for a moment, the words did not fully register, not with the students, not even with Harrington, because they were not framed as an attack, they were stated as fact. He blinked once, then again, his mind catching up, replaying his own lecture, the assumptions he had made, the steps he had presented with confidence. And there it was, subtle, buried deep within the structure, but real. A professor seated near the back slowly straightened, his brows lifting as he followed her reasoning. And then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. That small gesture did not go unnoticed, and like a spark catching dry air, it spread, one student after another beginning to see it, to trace the flaw, to understand what she had just uncovered. Harrington's posture shifted again. The certainty that once defined him now replaced with something far less comfortable. Something heavier, because this was no longer about a student outperforming expectations. This was about someone exposing a weakness in the very foundation he had built his authority on. That is, he started, but his voice faltered just enough to be heard, just enough to fracture the image he had maintained, and he cleared his throat, attempting to recover. That is an unconventional interpretation. But even as he said it, the words lacked conviction, because the room had already moved past that point. Sarah did not argue. She did not press further. She simply stepped slightly to the side, leaving the board visible, allowing the work to speak for itself. And in that quiet gesture, the power dynamic shifted completely. The students were no longer looking at him for answers. They were looking at the board, at her solution, at the truth laid out in clean white lines. The silence returned, deeper now, heavier, not empty but filled with realization. And in that silence, something else settled in, something far more unsettling for Harrington than any public mistake. The understanding that the woman he had tried to dismiss, to reduce to a moment of entertainment, had just demonstrated a level of clarity he could not easily dismiss. And as the weight of that realization pressed into the room, one question lingered unspoken in every mind, including his. Not who she embarrassed, but who she really was. The silence did not break. It deepened, stretching across the lecture hall like a weight no one could shake. And in that stillness, Professor Harrington realized something far more dangerous than being wrong. He realized he was no longer in control. His eyes remained fixed on the board, but the way he looked at it had changed, no longer with authority, but with the quiet urgency of someone trying to understand what had just happened before everyone else did. A faint clearing of a throat echoed from the back row, then another, subtle movements as students shifted in their seats, not out of boredom, but out of focus, their attention no longer anchored to him, but drawn entirely to the work Sarah had left behind. One student slowly raised a hand, hesitating before speaking. Professor, her method removes the instability completely. And the words, spoken with careful respect, landed harder than any challenge. Because they were not confrontational, they were observational, and they were correct. Harrington inhaled slowly, straightening his posture as if reclaiming a position that no longer quite fit. It is an alternative perspective, he said, choosing each word with precision, but the slight pause between them betrayed the strain beneath his composure. Sarah stood quietly to the side, her hands now resting at her sides, her gaze lowered just enough to avoid confrontation, yet steady enough to show she was not retreating. She had no need to defend what was already clear. The visiting professor in the back row leaned forward, his voice calm but unmistakably firm as he spoke. That is not just an alternative, that is a refinement. And with that, the shift became undeniable, because it did not come from a student. It came from someone who understood exactly what had been done. A ripple moved through the room again, this time carrying a quiet sense of awe, the kind that replaces doubt when evidence becomes impossible to ignore. Harrington turned slightly toward Sarah, studying her more closely now, not as an interruption, not as a distraction, but as a variable he had failed to account for. Where did you learn this approach? He asked, his tone controlled, but no longer dismissive. Sarah met his gaze briefly, then looked back at the board as if the answer was already there. I did not learn it the way you teach it, she said, her voice even, without edge, without pride, just truth. The simplicity of her response seemed to unsettle him more than anything else, because it offered no clear explanation, no background he could easily categorize, no familiar framework he could use to regain footing. A student near the aisle whispered, "Who is she?" And another answered softly, "I do not think we ever asked." And that quiet exchange carried through the space like a reflection everyone suddenly shared. Harrington glanced at the equation once more, then back at Sarah, and for the first time, there was hesitation in his next move, a pause that stretched just long enough to be felt, because whatever he said next would define not just this moment, but how the room would remember it. He stepped closer to the board, lifting a piece of chalk, his hand hovering for a second, as if considering whether to challenge, to correct, or to accept. And that hesitation spoke louder than any lecture he had given. Sarah did not move, did not interrupt. She simply watched. Her presence calm, grounded, as if she had already stepped beyond the need for validation. The air felt different now, heavier with understanding, lighter with the absence of pretense. And in that quiet, undeniable shift, the roles that had defined the room just minutes ago no longer held the same meaning. Because the person everyone had overlooked had not only solved the problem, she had changed the way it was seen. And as Harrington finally placed the chalk against the board, the question was no longer whether she was right, but whether he was ready to admit it. The chalk touched the board, but Professor Harrington did not write immediately. His hand paused there, as if the weight of the room had settled into his fingers, and for the first time in years, he was not certain what the next line should be. Every eye followed that small moment. The hesitation that would have gone unnoticed on any other day now felt amplified, because the balance of authority had already shifted, quietly, but completely. He cleared his throat, attempting to re-establish control. "Let us examine this carefully," he said, his tone measured, but lacking the effortless confidence it once carried. And slowly, deliberately, he began retracing Sarah's steps on the board, rewriting her solution line by line, as if testing it under scrutiny. But with each equation he confirmed, each transformation he verified, the tension in the room did not ease. It tightened, because nothing failed, nothing broke. Everything held with a precision that left no room for dismissal. A student in the front row leaned forward, whispering, "He cannot find a mistake." And the person beside him gave a barely perceptible shake of the head, eyes still locked on the board. Harrington moved to the final expression, the same place where Sarah had stopped, and his hand hovered again. The chalk just inches from the surface, because there was nothing left to correct, no adjustment to make without contradicting the logic he had just confirmed himself. The silence returned, heavier than before, and in that silence, something unspoken became understood by everyone present, including him. He slowly lowered the chalk, placing it on the tray beneath the board with a soft click that echoed more than it should have. And then he turned, not fully toward the class, but just enough to acknowledge what stood beside him. Sarah remained where she was, composed, her posture unchanged, her presence neither demanding attention nor avoiding it, simply existing in a way that now felt impossible to ignore. Harrington studied her for a moment longer, his expression no longer guarded by arrogance, but marked by something far more difficult to carry, recognition. "Your solution is correct," he said finally. The words measured, each one deliberate, and though they were simple, they carried a weight that settled across the room like a final note. A quiet exhale moved through the audience, not loud, not dramatic, but collective, as if everyone had been holding their breath for this exact moment. But it did not end there, because correctness was no longer the full story. The visiting professor stood from his seat, adjusting his jacket slightly before speaking, his voice calm but firm. "It is more than correct. It resolves the instability in a way that is both efficient and original." And that statement shifted the moment again, elevating it from validation to acknowledgement of something far greater. A few students exchanged looks, their earlier assumptions dissolving completely now, replaced by a kind of respect that did not need to be spoken aloud. Harrington's gaze returned to the board once more, then back to Sarah, and this time there was no trace of dismissal left, only a quiet understanding that whatever role he had assigned to her at the start of this moment no longer applied. "You have a background in mathematics?" he asked, more carefully now, as if the question itself required precision. Sarah met his eyes briefly, then glanced at the equation, her voice steady. "I used to," she replied, and though the words were simple, they carried a depth that suggested a story far beyond the walls of that lecture hall. A student near the back whispered, "Used to," but no one answered, because the question that mattered more was already forming in every mind. Harrington nodded slowly, absorbing her response, but it did not resolve the uncertainty, it deepened it, because whatever she had been, whatever she had done, It was clear now that it had not disappeared. It had only been hidden. The room remained still, not out of discomfort, but out of recognition. The kind that settles in when something undeniable has just taken place, something that changes how you see what was right in front of you all along. And as Sarah stood there, no longer invisible, no longer underestimated, the truth of the moment did not need to be explained, because everyone had already felt it, and it was not going away. The words I used to did not fade when Sarah spoke them. They lingered, echoing in the minds of everyone in the room, because they carried a quiet weight that no one could ignore. And for Professor Harrington, they opened a door he had not expected to face. He studied her more closely now, not just her presence, but the details he had dismissed before, the steady posture, the calm control, the absence of any need to prove herself beyond what she had already done, and it began to settle into him that this was not an accident, not a moment of luck, but something far more deliberate. Used to, he repeated slowly, as if testing the meaning behind the words. That suggests experience. And though his tone remained measured, there was a shift in it. A quiet respect beginning to replace the edge that had defined him earlier. Sarah gave a small nod, not dramatic, not defensive, just enough to acknowledge the truth without expanding on it. And that restraint only deepened the curiosity in the room. A student near the center raised a hand, then hesitated, unsure if the rules of the lecture still applied, before speaking anyway. If you do not mind me asking, why are you working here? The question hung in the air, not disrespectful, but genuine. Reflecting what everyone else was thinking, Sarah's gaze softened slightly, not from discomfort, but from memory, as if the answer existed somewhere beyond the walls of that lecture hall. Life changes direction, she said simply, her voice calm. But understanding does not disappear just because circumstances do. And that answer, quiet as it was, seemed to settle deeper than any detailed explanation could have. Harrington absorbed her words in silence, his mind moving through the implications, through the years he had spent defining expertise by position, by title, by visible achievement, and now, standing in front of him, was a contradiction to that entire framework. The visiting professor stepped forward slightly, his interest no longer hidden. Have you published? He asked, his tone respectful, as one would address a colleague, rather than a stranger, and that subtle shift did not go unnoticed by anyone present. Sarah paused for a brief moment, her eyes lowering just slightly, as if considering how much of her past to reveal. A long time ago, she answered, under a different name. And that single sentence changed the atmosphere again, because it confirmed what many had already begun to suspect, that she was not just capable, she was once recognized. A few students exchanged quick glances, their earlier perceptions dissolving completely now, replaced by a growing realization that they had overlooked something extraordinary simply because it did not fit the image they expected. Harrington exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment settling into something more permanent, something that could not be undone by a simple acknowledgement, because what had happened here was not just a correction of a problem, it was a correction of perspective. He looked at the board once more, then back at Sarah, and this time, there was no hesitation in his voice. You saw something the rest of us missed, he said, and the admission, though simple, carried a sincerity that had been absent before. Sarah did not respond immediately. She simply glanced at the equation, then back at him, her expression steady. It was always there, she said softly. It just needed to be seen differently. And in that moment, the lesson extended far beyond the mathematics on the board, settling into the room in a way no lecture ever had. Because it was no longer about equations or methods. It was about perception, about the quiet danger of assuming you understand someone based on what you see. And as that realization took hold, the room did not erupt into applause. It did not break into conversation. It remained still, because some truths do not need noise to be understood. They only need a moment of silence to be felt. And in that silence, everything had changed. No one spoke for several seconds, not because they did not have questions, but because something far more powerful had taken hold of the room, a quiet recalibration of everything they thought they understood, and Professor Harrington felt it more than anyone. The authority he had carried into this lecture was still there, but it no longer stood alone. It had been met, matched, and in one undeniable moment, surpassed. He glanced toward the audience, noticing the way their attention no longer centered on him, but moved between him and Sarah, as if the balance of knowledge in the room had shifted into shared space, and that realization pressed against him with a weight that demanded a response. "Miss Mitchell," he said, his voice steadier now, but carrying a different tone, one shaped by recognition rather than control. "Would you be willing to explain your reasoning from the beginning?" The request landed gently, but its meaning was clear. It was no longer a challenge. It was an invitation. Sarah hesitated for the briefest moment, not out of uncertainty, but out of consideration, as if deciding whether stepping further into the spotlight was necessary, and then she nodded once. Turning back toward the board, she picked up the chalk again, but this time, the movement felt different, not as someone proving a point, but as someone guiding others to see what she already understood. "The original method assumes stability under repetition," she began, her voice calm, steady enough to carry without force. "But that assumption only holds if the boundary conditions remain consistent." And as she spoke, she rewrote the opening lines, simplifying them, stripping away the unnecessary layers that had once made the problem seem more complex than it needed to be. The students leaned forward again, but this time there was no laughter, no skepticism, only focus. Because they were no longer watching to see if she would fail, they were listening to understand. Harrington remained still, his eyes following each step, not searching for error now, but absorbing the clarity of her explanation, and with every line she rewrote, the structure of the problem became more transparent, more accessible, until what once felt advanced began to feel almost intuitive. "When you remove the assumption," Sarah continued, drawing a clean line through a section of the original framework, "you are forced to rebuild the solution from a more stable foundation." And that single statement carried more weight than an entire lecture, because it revealed not just how to solve the problem, but how to think differently about it. A student in the back whispered, "That changes everything." And another replied softly, "It makes it easier." And those words spread quietly, reinforcing what everyone was beginning to feel, that complexity had been replaced with clarity. The visiting professor nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful, recognizing the elegance not just in the solution, but in the mindset behind it. Sarah stepped back once more, setting the chalk down gently, her explanation complete, and again, she did not look for approval. She did not wait for validation. She simply allowed the work to stand on its own. Harrington exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing, not because the situation had resolved, but because it had transformed into something he could no longer deny. "That is remarkably clear," he said, and this time, there was no hesitation in his voice, only honesty. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of understanding, the kind that settles in when something meaningful has just been revealed. Sarah gave a small nod, acknowledging his words without amplifying them, and turned slightly as if preparing to step away, to return to the role she had occupied before this moment began. But as she did, the question that had been forming in the room became impossible to ignore, because now that they had seen what she could do, what she understood, and how she thought, the idea of her simply walking back into invisibility no longer made sense. And as that realization took hold, it became clear that this moment was not just about what had happened on the board. It was about what would happen next. Sarah's hand left the chalk resting on the tray, and for a moment, it seemed as if she might simply walk away, return to the quiet routine that had kept her invisible for so long. But the room was no longer willing to let that happen. The silence held, but it was different now, charged with expectation rather than uncertainty, and Professor Harrington felt it pressing against him, demanding something more than acknowledgement, something that would define what this moment meant beyond a single problem solved. He stepped forward, slightly, his voice steady but carrying a weight that had not been there before. "Miss Mitchell," he said, and this time her name did not sound like a formality. It sounded like recognition. "Would you consider sharing more of your work with us?" The question landed softly, but its implications spread quickly through the room, drawing the attention of every student, every observer, because it was no longer about a demonstration. It was about an invitation into a space she had never been given before. Sarah paused, her gaze shifting briefly toward the rows of students, then back to the board, as if measuring the distance between where she stood and where she was being asked to step. "I am not sure that is my place," she replied, her voice calm, not dismissive, but grounded in a reality she had accepted long before this moment began. A faint murmur moved through the room, not of disagreement, but of disbelief, because after what they had just witnessed, the idea that she did not belong felt impossible to reconcile. The visiting professor took a step forward, his expression thoughtful, his tone respectful. "Understanding does not require permission," he said, and the simplicity of his words seemed to settle into the space between them, reframing the question entirely. Harrington glanced at him, then back at Sarah, and for a brief moment, something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement not just of her ability, but of the system that had allowed it to remain unseen. A student near the front raised her hand, her voice hesitant but sincere. "You explained it better than any lecture I have heard," she said, and another added quietly, "You made it make sense," and those words, simple as they were, carried more weight than applause ever could, because they reflected something real, something that could not be staged or forced. Sarah's expression softened slightly, not with pride, but with a quiet awareness of the impact she had made, something she had not expected, perhaps something she had not allowed herself to consider. Harrington exhaled slowly, the last remnants of his earlier certainty dissolving into something more honest. "This institution values clarity," he said carefully, choosing his words with intention. "And what you demonstrated today, that is clarity." And as he spoke, the room seemed to lean into the moment, recognizing that what was happening now was no longer about correction, but about change. Sarah looked at him, truly looked this time, as if seeing not just the man who had challenged her, but the one who now stood in front of her with a different understanding, and for a second, the tension that had defined their interaction dissolved into something quieter, something more human. "I only saw what was there," she said softly, her voice carrying across the room with the same calm certainty it had held from the beginning. And in that statement, she placed the focus not on herself, but on the truth itself, as if reminding everyone that what mattered was not who discovered it, but that it had been seen. The room fell still again, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that needed to be understood had already taken root. And as Sarah stood there, no longer invisible, no longer overlooked, it became clear that this moment had moved beyond a single equation, beyond a single lecture, into something that would not be easily forgotten, because once you see someone differently, you cannot return to what you believed before. And as that realization settled into every corner of the room, one truth remained undeniable. The person they had dismissed at the start was now the one they could not stop listening to. No one rushed to fill the silence, because what had just unfolded did not need applause to be understood. It needed time. And as Sarah stood there, the weight of the moment settled fully into the room, reshaping every assumption that had existed before she picked up that piece of chalk. Professor Harrington remained still for a moment longer, his eyes no longer searching for flaws, but reflecting something far more difficult to confront: humility, the quiet kind that does not announce itself, but changes everything it touches. He took a slow breath, then stepped aside, not out of obligation, but with intention, creating space where there had once been none, and in that small gesture, the shift became complete. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady, not loud, but clear enough to carry to the back of the hall, and though the words were simple, they held a sincerity that no one in that room could mistake. Sarah gave a slight nod, accepting the acknowledgement without drawing attention to it, her posture unchanged, her presence still calm, as if the magnitude of what had just occurred did not require her to become anything more than who she already was. A student near the front slowly closed her laptop, not because the lecture was over, but because something more important had just been learned, something that could not be typed or summarized, only understood. The visiting professor stepped forward once more, his expression thoughtful. "There is a lecture next month on advanced stability models," he said, glancing briefly at Harrington before returning his attention to Sarah. "I believe your perspective would add something valuable." And again, the room leaned into the possibility, not with pressure, but with quiet anticipation. Sarah paused, her gaze moving briefly across the rows of students, then back to the board, where the equations remained, clear and undeniable, a silent record of everything that had just shifted, and for a moment, it seemed as if she might decline, retreat back into the life that had allowed her to remain unseen. But something had changed, not just in the room, but in how that room now saw her. "I will think about it," she said finally, her voice even, leaving the answer open, but not closed, and that was enough. Harrington nodded once, accepting her response without pressing further, because he understood now that respect was not something to be demanded or directed, it was something to be earned. And in that moment, it had been. The lecture hall remained quiet, not out of discomfort, but out of recognition, the kind that lingers long after the moment has passed. And as Sarah turned to retrieve her cleaning cart near the door, there was a subtle shift in the way the students watched her, not with curiosity alone, but with something deeper, something grounded in understanding. No one laughed, no one whispered, no one dismissed her presence, because they could not anymore. The board behind her still carried the solution, unchanged, a reminder that truth does not depend on who presents it, only that it is seen. Harrington remained near the front, his gaze lingering on the equations, then briefly on Sarah as she reached the doorway. And though he said nothing more, the lesson had already been delivered in a way no lecture ever could. And as the door opened quietly, and she stepped out, returning to a world that had not yet caught up with what had just been revealed, the room behind her stayed still for a moment longer, because everyone there understood something they had not understood before, that brilliance does not always announce itself. And the moment you assume you know who matters, you risk missing the one person who changes everything. And that day, in the quiet of a lecture hall, the meaning of respect was not explained, it was revealed.